Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that has broken its spending limit. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. I've just got back from doing the patriotic duty of touring the royal palaces.
Oh, very nice. Did you see the Queen?
No, she wasn't in. Sadly, a flag flying doesn't mean the Queen's in, since they changed the law like 10 years ago or something. So it has to be a specific flag. Fun fact.
Was at least Meghan in? Like, there's got to be a grade of royal you saw who was in, right?
I think Buckingham Palace is only open in the summer because that's when no one's around. They're all up in Balmoral or wherever they are. And obviously Meghan's in a different palace with Harry. So they all have their own palaces. There's a lot of palaces. I didn't do them all. I just did Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle.
That sounds super cool anyway.
Yeah, it was a pretty good day. I'm not going to lie. Nice for a Monday. Headline Quickfire. So our first one, which I think you want to tie into another story as well. Trump strikes deal with EU to prevent trade war in the Times.
This is the story, sort of the aftermath of Trump's whirlwind tour around Europe. I think we talked on our last podcast about that Trump had visited Britain. Also in that tour, he visited the EU and NATO and gave a big sort of shouting at to the EU about various, that they weren't spending enough for their military. And then he went on to Russia, where he had a rather cozier meeting with President Putin, which didn't go down well at home. Some of the major news networks, even Fox at the time, said it was a really disgraceful performance from the president. And one of the lines that Fox took most umbrage with was when Trump was asked, do you think that Russia hacked the election? He said that there was no reason that they wouldn't. He said there's no reason. So I've made the same mistake that Trump did now. That's terrible. He said that there's no reason why they would, and kind of seemed to suggest that, well, if President Putin told me they didn't hack it, then I'm going to believe President Putin rather than my own security services. In an astonishing turn of events, the day afterwards, Trump came out and said, no, when I said I would, I really meant I wouldn't, which led to lots of jokes online and basically saying, you can't believe anything this president says, which makes me take this headline, actually, that Trump strikes a deal with the EU to prevent a trade war with a little pinch of salt. Because apparently Trump has met with the EU to say that he won't be imposing any tariffs on EU goods as part of a deal, rather than go to a trade war with the EU. And on the result of that, the markets have gone up. Everybody's recovered because the markets were worried that a trade war could be costly for the global economy and might stop the flow of international trade, see people return to protectionist policies, and might cost, I think, over 500 million was a figure I saw. But
that's a big figure.
Yeah. But there's a lot of big figures you can just sort of band around. So Trump has said this, but I must reiterate, it's only something he said and not something he signed. With everything Trump does, I will believe it when I actually see it on paper rather than believe what he says.
Fair enough. I also think maybe another thing that came out of that was Trump was threatening all these trade deals, trade wars sort of stuff, and then didn't realize that people could do it back to him. Seemed to be like a takeaway that I saw.
Yeah, the Chinese went quite hard on American goods, haven't they, as a response?
Yeah. So I think maybe he underestimated how much people would do it back to him if he did it to them. But we will see how it turns out. So on to our next headline from the Daily Mail. Furnace Friday. Yeah,
this was the news that temperatures around Britain were going to reach a high of, I think it was about 33 in London, if not 35. Very, very warm after 2 weeks of just non-stop sunshine, no rain. And as a Brit, it was just,
We're not used to this. We're not built for this. And I can't remember a heat wave that has lasted this long. When we say heat wave, we normally mean a few days. We don't mean several weeks without rain. The grass is dead. That doesn't happen. This is Britain. We've rained on it for 400 years. It should be bright green.
Yeah.
It's been insane. I've eaten a lot of ice cream, a lot of ice, anything to keep me cool. All the windows open. It's been pretty horrific over here. I'd also like to add in an amusing headline. So for once, I think this is the Daily Star actually giving us some daily news about the effect of a star. with Heatwave Brits at boiling point, which I just quite liked, and it just had a giant picture of the sun behind it. I mean, I suppose it would have been better if it had been led in the Sun. There's a lot of newspapers about the Sun, really.
Yeah.
Never really noticed that before. And now our next headline from The Independent: May snubbed by Europe as no-deal Brexit looms.
This is the story that sort of continues on from one of our main stories last time, which was about the Chequers deal that Theresa May had struck with her cabinet. And basically this was the big blueprint that Theresa May had said she was going to go to the EU, and this was the UK's negotiating position. Last time, I think I pointed out a couple of flaws in that negotiating position, that it doesn't really solve the Northern Ireland border process. Trade's a little bit iffy as well. And surprise, surprise, now May has sort of taken it to the EU. They've said, no, you're going to have to sort this out, come back with another plan that maybe we can sign off of, because this one isn't good enough. This means, as the headline suggests, that it raises again the possibility of a no Brexit deal. If Theresa May had to sort of lose prominent cabinet members to get this through, to get a compromise deal through that barely passed through Parliament before it broke out for the summer, to then go to the EU with that deal and have it rejected is pretty damning of the Brexit process overall. It just once again raises that no deal prospect and pushes us towards that cliff edge.
Which we don't want. We really don't want it.
No,
please no.
No. I don't know if you saw the Times headline as well on Sunday that suggested that the army might have to be involved to ship around food and medicine supplies as a result of no deal. It's getting into, I think Andrew Neil, who does one of the main politics programs over here, said it was entering the theatre of the absurd. And I mean, it is kind of, when you say that the army is going to get involved, that seems ridiculous. But if it actually happens, then you get a sense of the scope of political crisis it would be if we entered no deal territory.
And so on to a headline I don't really understand because I don't follow sport. In the Sunday Times, I just had to add this because it just sounds ridiculous. Exposed. Qatar sabotage World Cup rivals with black ops.
Yeah, this is the story that, the controversial 2022 World Cup bid by Qatar, that won, actually employed some underhand tactics in order to get the World Cup. Now, people had suspected this for some time, mainly because Qatar is a country that we'd have to play football in the desert in blazing heat that none of the teams would be used to. So they've already had to move it to a Winter World Cup to accommodate that. There's already been controversy over the way that these stadiums are being built, with migrant workers that are basically equivalent to slaves and the people who died making the stadiums. The bid also came in at the same time as FIFA executive Sepp Blatter was being investigated for corruption, and there was a lot of corruption around alleged corruption, I should say, around the Russian and Qatari bids. And this is sort of the final nail in the coffin, that not only did Qatar perhaps bribe FIFA officials to vote for their World Cup, they were also actively running a sort of misinformation campaign against their rivals in the US. And I can't remember where else it was. I think it was maybe one of the other European countries saying that, these countries who've bid for it, the population don't really want the World Cup. It wouldn't be good for them as a nation. We're the ones who should take it forward. So yeah, I know it sounds silly, but in football, this is a big story, and it's probably pretty unlikely that Qatar will get the World Cup taken away from them. But again, it kind of suggests that FIFA maybe should impose sanctions on Qatar or something like this to make sure it doesn't happen again with any future World Cup bid.
I mean, that's fair enough. I think you've given me quite a good summary, considering I had no idea how the story's going. And I know that Qatar is probably not the best place to host a World Cup. They'd have to host it in December, I believe, because that's the only time when it gets to about 19 degrees Celsius. From having actually been to Qatar, do not go in September. It was 45 degrees and it wasn't a dry heat. It was like 70 or 80% humidity. I would walk outside and immediately be drenched and feel like I wanted to die. I cannot recommend it as a tourist destination. It's mostly a work destination. It's a weird country. This is a complete aside that their population is about 200,000 Qataris and 2.1 million expats from various other countries.
Jeez, okay.
It's a weird place.
Yeah, no idea.
It's led to the rules there are interesting because obviously it's a predominantly Muslim country, so they don't eat pork, they don't have alcohol. But because there are so many foreigners there, they basically have to offer bacon and alcohol to people who visit. So they have special shops where you can go and you can show your passport, and as long as you're not a local, you can buy bacon and booze. Or as I described it, and is now still the name of a chat between me and my friends on Messenger, limited access to gin and bacon. It's trying time to be British, really.
Yeah.
And now for our next headline from the Financial Times. Deutsche Bank shifts half its euro clearing from London to Frankfurt.
This is probably most closely linked to the May snub by Europe headline. Deutsche Bank, which is quite a big financial concern for most of Europe and the world, shifting half of its euros from London to Frankfurt suggests that they want their money in their country, so it's safe if a no deal happens. We've already touched on what would happen in a no deal, but certainly the financial consequences would be quite severe. And they could even be quite severe, even if no deal doesn't happen, but everybody's scared it will. Do you sort of remember when the pound just decreased in value on the Brexit result, even though Brexit was far, far away and we hadn't even sort of enforced Article 50 yet? Because of that, Deutsche Bank is looking to clear half of its euro stock. It would be a worrying sign for Theresa May if more banks start to follow suit.
Of course, this was a big thing that was mentioned before the vote, right? That companies would want to leave if we voted to leave. And everyone was like, no, it won't happen. It seems like it is. Yeah,
we're reaching the crunch point now where actually people will have to put their contingency plans into place. No deal happens.
And our final headline this evening, which we've kind of hinted at already, Brexit food crisis fury from the Daily Express.
This is the story that in the result of a no deal, we might struggle to get food into the country and feed our population. One of the quotes online, I don't know if you saw this, was I think it was the Brexit minister Dominic Raab, who, when asked about if there would be a food crisis surrounding Brexit, replied that there would be adequate food.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you've seen this going around, but I'll have to try and find the original link on Twitter. 2016, we will leave the European Union and we will forge a new future for Britain. 2018, we will have adequate food.
Yes, I've seen it plastered on the side of the Brexit bus. We will provide adequate food. The meme of the guy looking back at the girl. I don't even know what that one's called. Do you know the one I mean, when he's holding the hand of his girlfriend and he's looking over his shoulder? Yeah, I
know exactly which one you mean.
Yeah,
I bet it has a name.
Yeah. I've seen that one with him looking, enticingly at adequate food. Because this one comes from the Daily Express, Brexit food crisis fury, the Express are furious that anyone would even suggest that we will have a food crisis. It's simply not going to happen. This is more scaremongering by Project Fear, although this time it isn't Project Fear who's saying it, it's the actual Conservative government in charge of Brexit. But never mind about that.
Brief aside here for some live update there. Mm-hmm. It's the distracted boyfriend meme, also known as man looking at other woman. Memes, they're well named.
Yeah, cool. I'm always up for the memes. Yeah, give me more memes.
Another thing I saw on Facebook, I think today, was something along the lines of it's something when the 5th largest economy in the world is saying it has to stockpile food and medicine in case it shoots itself in the foot, or something along those lines.
Yeah,
which is it's not looking great. It's not a good look. Let's put it that way. It's not a good look, to quote John Oliver. And our main news story tonight: Vote Leave broke spending limits and electoral law. So what happened, Rob?
So this is a story that's sort of been breaking in the background whilst we've been having this. We've been running this podcast, and I haven't really focused on it yet because there was nothing really concrete to go on. But earlier this month, something concrete did come out. So just to give a little background to it, earlier in May, the official Leave campaign was fined over £70,000 for spending over roughly that amount on the Vote Leave sort of election campaign for Britain to leave the European Union. Then on the 17th of July, Vote Leave was fined another £60,000 for showing that they'd funneled funds into a sort of a different Vote Leave campaign. So it was a group called Believe, BE, and then a capital L, and then Leave. And that was fronted by a sort of a 20-year-old law student called Darren Grimes. It was proven that the official Vote Leave campaign put nearly £500,000 into the group, and there was sort of email proof that these two groups worked side by side, which is not allowed in electoral law because essentially you've got to make sure that you know where all the money's coming from and who's spending it. As a result, Darren Grimes has now had an official police investigation into himself, and the official Vote Leave spokesperson, David Halsall, are being invested by the police as we speak for electoral
investigated.
fraud. Yeah, sorry, investigated for electoral fraud.
I mean, one thing I think is interesting about this, because we had a whistleblower earlier in the year. I know that I believe Darren Grimes has basically said, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, he may have said something new, but I believe he's kind of doubled down and said, oh no, they never did anything wrong, and I'll fight this. But essentially it seems like some fairly young people were taken advantage of by the official Vote Leave campaign, because they got them to sign all this paperwork when they weren't exactly sure what it was. They're just, I'll just sign this, it'll be fine, and kind of created this thing in a rush. And I think that's also a problem here, that it seems like 2 or 3 people's lives could be ruined because they were tricked by the official campaign, as well as the fact that there's the overspend, which could have led to the change in the result.
Yes, certainly. I think you're absolutely right there, that this might be an individual who didn't really know the seriousness of electoral law. We'll talk about it a bit later, but electoral campaign spending's always been something where parties and groups try to bend the law to suit them, but the difference between bending the law and actually breaking the law is quite serious when it comes to the legal terms. And if you're the person who signed off on that, then you're the one ultimately liable. And yes, maybe I don't want to say anything too libelous, but with the people who were involved in the Vote Leave campaign, that's a brave person who decides to be the legal sort of one legally responsible if anything like this were to go down. So the fact he may have been taken advantage of is a little dodgy.
So we've touched on it briefly that having a lot of money put in that group is a problem, but why is it a problem? Why do we care about how much money is spent here? I mean, in the US, they can basically spend as much money as they like on their campaigns, right? So why do we care about this?
Well, we care quite a bit, and I would just, with the USA point, they spend way more money than we do, but they do have quite strict campaign finance limits as well. So it's been an issue it's an issue in US politics for quite some years. And essentially the main problem that Western democracy has, in a sense, is that if anybody can vote and anybody's free to be influenced by stuff, there is a danger that simply if you don't put any limit on spending, the people with the most money will win every time, because they will have the power and the resources to influence the media, control the message, and just simply outspend the other candidate. That isn't always true. Going back to your US example, Donald Trump sort of boasted after he won the election that he spent far less than Hillary Clinton. And some may argue that's just because he had different campaign tactics. The fact that Donald Trump could say anything and basically get a free message across on news channels, because the news channels were always running the ridiculous thing that Donald Trump said, sort of like boosted where he spent his money. But anyway, that's an issue for another day. When we're looking at this kind of stuff, it's about rich candidates being able to outspend. The other factor is that there's also a fear that where campaigns gather their sums of money from. So if there's one big wealthy benefactor, then it's undemocratic if you don't know who that person is who's funding it, because it could allow just one powerful individual to have a big impact on the result of the election. This sort of spending by Vote Leave was always an issue, but Vote Leave accused the government and Remain of their own dirty tactics and argued that they in fact had a spending advantage. So the best example of this is that before the vote, I don't know if you got one through your letterbox as well, but do you remember this leaflet funded by the government that basically said why the EU is great?
I remember the one you're referring to. I'm not sure if I personally had one.
Okay.
But I in general am worried about this kind of, that there's a lot of these kind of going around now. I think I mentioned it previously when we were talking about local elections. So that the Lib Dems do one that looks a bit like a local paper, but it's still kind of obviously very yellow and Lib Demi. And then there are others that definitely have, like they might have a smaller conservative logo as they can get away with on the back of the page, for example. And I'm not saying it's entirely the Conservatives. I think it's all the parties have done this to an extent. But you see these all over the place. And I think it is quite I think it's disingenuous, and we should change the rules on how much like an official document or how much like a newspaper these things can look, because they are intentionally designed to confuse, I think. And it's easy enough to think that someone could be taken in by this. I'm not saying everyone's been taken in by it, but I personally am very against this type of political advertising, because I think it's not like, I don't think it's fair, especially if only one side in an area is using it. Again, I'm not trying to lay a blame on any particular party here, but I have seen a variety of examples from multiple parties, and I don't like it.
Yeah, no, it's a big issue with how they present it and how they format it. But at least the one sort of small thing in their favour of those leaflets is that they are legally obliged. The reason why they try and put a Conservative logo on there as small as possible is because they are legally obliged to put it on there. If they don't put it on there, they are far more liable if it's then found out that, Labour tried to put forward this leaflet which said that the Lib Dems were awful, but didn't say who it was from. The fact that Vote Leave, just to link it back to my original point, the fact that Vote Leave didn't like that government leaflet was because it wasn't even from any political party. It was just from the government. So the funding for that leaflet came not from with any campaign spending limits on the referendum, but just came from the public purse, from tax. And the government just said, oh, this is just the government doing this. This isn't the Conservatives. This isn't Labour. This isn't Remain. This is Her Majesty's government, so we can publish what we want as this sort of like public information leaflet. But yeah, I can see what you say about how you represent that information and what's done from it. The big point that what that's led to, so you can see how leaflets are designed to maybe mislead the electorate in some way, to suggest that, to make it not clear that it's an advert. Like you say, some of the newspaper styles can make it feel like it's more of an information bulletin, or here's just a local newspaper for you, this with some information. Gosh, they're talking a lot of rubbish about the Conservatives in this, blah blah blah. Like that stuff. At least it's, although it might be disingenuous, at least it's traceable back to the party who produced it. Now with social media, you can do a very, very similar thing, but you're not really obliged to say who it's from, or at least political parties and organizations have ways of getting around that and being able to hide who it's actually from. So there was an example that the BBC gave recently, and I've left a link which you might want to share in the show notes, that shows some of the Facebook online adverts that we use to target like a wide demographic of possible Leave voters. So Vote Leave spent about £2.7 million on ads targeting specific groups of people. So if you have a look at these ads, there's everything from a photo of a Spanish bullfighter that says these are animals, not entertainment, stop the abuse. There's one that targets Green voters, so the EU blocks our ability to speak out and protect polar bears. Click to help them. The one I think is particularly silly is the European Union wants to kill our cuppa with a cup of tea with a British flag out of it, Big Ben behind it, a red butt, just the most stock image of a cup of tea you can find, and an angry fist with the European flag logo on it, which I don't know, maybe that's in the realm of the Bendy Bananas story in terms of rubbish, but there's no clear link who that's from. It's clearly an anti-EU advert, but it doesn't say in big letters anywhere that this is from the official Vote Leave campaign. Yeah. I think some of my other ones, sort of like influential ones, are the I agree with Corbyn on the EU. I may have mentioned this in previous episodes, but I watched some Vote Leave video that was shared on Facebook. That was one which was pretty clearly Vote Leave, and one tactic that they used was quoting Corbyn before he became Labour leader, and using his words where he said the EU's rubbish, and essentially saying, if you like Jeremy Corbyn, you should vote against the EU, which was not the official line of the Labour Party at the time.
I mean, I know we've mentioned the big red bus before, but the NHS one there uses the NHS logo, and it looks almost like an NHS sponsored advert, and has no mention of the campaign. And I think that's pretty bad. I mean, the bus, at least we knew whose bus it was. That on its own comes across as if it is an advert. Like, if I saw that, it would take me a second to go, really? Like, obviously, in the context of the referendum, I was looking out for this kind of stuff. But, like, I mean, it is a bit of a crappy stock photo of someone laying hands on a sick person's head. But other than that, like, it doesn't look like one of those awful adverts you get on Facebook. It does actually look like something that you might click on, and you can, you can see yourself potentially clicking on that and then being like, oh, some of the others do look more like those awful adverts you get on Facebook that you just ignore.
But one of the most interesting things I found about it is there's one that says we need an immigration system that ensures British young people more jobs. That's got a big logo on it, and the logo they've got on it is from the Believe campaign, the one that's just been indicted. And there's another one on the economy. I think it was stated that they thought that about most of the information that was put through Believe not only helped with those adverts, but helped to pay a data firm called Aggregate IQ, and that may have enabled them to sort of precisely target the voters they wanted to influence to help sway the Brexit result. The other little bit from that BBC article as well is they said that Vote Leave launched a giant data harvesting exercise, which essentially was on at the same time as the football. So they encouraged you to predict all the results of the football for a fee, and whatever information you put into there probably asked you a couple of questions about Brexit on the way, and then put you into a group to target. And that's stuff that the Electoral Commission has virtually no control over. It's hard to trace that. It's hard to stop it before it happens. It's hard to act on it after the fact. And in those instances, we're sort of relying on companies like Facebook and Google to be more vigilant about who's paying them the money and how they're using it, which I think it's fair to say that they're getting better at, but maybe it's come a little too late after two fairly substantial elections that people feel were influenced by Facebook misinformation or fake news campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, there is a bigger story here that has been done to death on podcasts that actually deal with technology stuff on a regular basis, that many of which I listen to, but I can probably put a link or two in the show notes. But yeah, there is a bigger issue here about people kind of assuming that tech firms already have this stuff in place. And while I'm generally pro tech firms, there have been, in this instance, a lot of problems where, the idea of a free and open internet, which is great, has had some problems where, like, there haven't been checks and balances on this stuff. And we've seen this, the same kind of story comes up time and time again. Some limits do need to be put onto certain services, but the problem is how we actually go about doing it in an informed manner. And I think probably Google and Facebook are approaching this in their own way in the hopes that they don't get slapped with a load of legislation, which it is good in some ways. I feel there probably should be some legislation, but I'm sure I agree with certain people at the moment who would try and put the wrong legislation in place. We've also seen a lot of discussion recently in the US with net neutrality. I think we've probably mentioned this previously on this podcast, where even Barack Obama's name was used on a fake comment to say that they should get rid of net neutrality. So there are problems. There are problems that need to be addressed. But yeah, whether certain people who are currently in power in various places should be involved in writing those laws is a bigger question that we can't answer now in the middle of this, but we're aware of this, and there are better discussions of this out there.
Yeah, the one small point I had relating to that is that the recent Irish referendum on abortion, effectively Facebook and Google banned adverts that came from outside of Ireland or stopped them to an extent, which effectively sort of stopped US lobby groups who might have an interest in stopping abortion rights in Ireland getting involved. So trying to limit foreign influence or limit where those adverts are coming from is something that they've started to do, or they saw the potential effects in that referendum and tried to turn it off. But I think you're entirely right. This is something where we're sort of still at the mercy of Facebook and Google, and having some actual legislation in place by governments who seek to promote free and fair elections, probably what you want, rather than tech firms who are just doing it because they're afraid they might get sued or slapped on the wrist at some date.
So moving on from this, they did a bad.
Yeah,
they've been fined for doing a bad. Does that mean we can redo the referendum? Does that mean we could, is there precedence for this? Have we rerun elections in the past where people have been found manipulating votes in this way? Manipulating not manipulating votes, sorry, manipulating the public in this way?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of examples, but I'll just run you through one. So in 2010, there was a Labour MP called Phil Wallace. He was found guilty of manipulating photos on his leaflets to make it look like his main rival, a Lib Dem MP, had basically been arrested by armed guards. The Lib Dem MP also stated that the leaflets issued by Wallace falsely portrayed him as taking unlawful foreign donations and linked him to Muslim extremists. And the result of this election was that the Labour candidate Phil Wallace won by 106 votes. So it was super likely that with such a narrow margin that these election leaflets that effectively had lies in them would have had an effect. The result was that the election was rerun. The Lib Dem candidate still lost, but the Labour candidate, Phil Wallace, basically lost his job, lost his place in the Labour Party, and it was all very embarrassing for all concerned. The second example is that, do you remember this Tory election fraud kind of hashtag that was going round after the 2015 election and sort of into 2016?
I think I do briefly, yes.
It was a story that sort of rolled on, and Channel 4 covered it in quite a lot of depth. Essentially, it's closer to our story tonight about campaign spending. There's essentially allegations that campaign funds hadn't been spent correctly in individual constituencies, most centred around the use of David Cameron and his battle bus, which was a name for his big bus that he drove around to constituencies. He would land there, try to influence the election, and would drive off to the next one. And on election day, he did sort of a whirlwind tour around the country. One of the places he really needed to visit was South Thanet, where the Conservative MP was up against Nigel Farage. And there was a real worry for the Conservatives that if they lost to the UKIP leader, then it would be very embarrassing for them and would show a small victory for UKIP. Essentially, the MP for South Thanet was charged by the Crown Prosecution Service for going over his spending limit. But the problem was that this was revealed only 2 days before the 2017 general election. So there's no time to call a by-election or rerun it again because they're rerunning it in 2 days' time anyway. So the election services were left pretty toothless then with what they could do. But there was a possibility that they might have run a by-election to rerun that election basically and check the result was fair.
So the usual thing I would put in front of my post now if I was on Reddit or something is, I am not a lawyer, I am Al. But it sounds there like there is precedence for a vote being rerun and a second time where the vote would have been rerun, but just due to circumstances, it was too late to actually do it. Because, as you say, there's no point in having a by-election 2 days before general election because you'd have an MP for 2 days. That's a bit silly. Yeah. So seeing as there is precedence, does that mean a second referendum?
I think it is really unlikely that we'll have a second referendum in between now and when Article 50 is triggered. I think there's a few reasons for that. Mostly that the Electoral Commission has quite like a small amount of influence it can actually do. Like running a by-election is very different to making sure that you rerun an entire nationwide referendum campaign again. And the bigger point is that to enforce such an action, it would probably need the support of at least one of the major political parties, both of which who are still in favour of going ahead with Brexit, essentially. So I think from that point of view, a second referendum because of these findings is unlikely, which will frustrate Remainers who will feel that the result was sort of stolen from them. To use a football analogy, the hand of God with Maradona, it was clearly a handball. Everybody saw it, but the referee didn't see it at the time. And guess what? They didn't rerun the match. You had to carry on with it. You had to deal with it. You had to put your hands up and say, "Oh, it's really frustrating. We should have got a decision. The decision went against us. However, there's little we can do to rerun it." The one thing that could maybe force a second referendum is that if public opinion has significantly shifted to think that we shouldn't leave the EU and that we should remain. Essentially, since about, I've put a link, and hopefully we'll put a link in the show notes to the polls. So I might just merge this with our little poll watch section because we're going to point on a couple of things and a couple of trends here. But since January in 2017, the majority of people thought that we were right to leave the EU. Since then, it's been ticking down and down, and now for about the past 6 months, I'd say. The majority of people think that we were wrong to have left the EU, and there seems to have been a significant dip in July with this news of the Chequers agreement and that effect. It's still pretty close. It's still a couple of percentage points, but it at least suggests that public opinion is slowly changing and that people regret the decision to leave the EU. However, the more interesting poll that happened afterwards was people asked, like, what should happen next? And a variety of different questions. I'll read through a few, but like Brexit should be abandoned altogether. Negotiations should try and get the Prime Minister's deal agreed because it's the only remaining chance of getting Brexit through. Basically, the PM should go back to the drawing board and come up with a better idea. We should delay Article 50. We should refuse to make any more concessions with the EU and leave without a Brexit deal, and don't know. And of those two choices, there's a pretty clear three-way split between Brexit should be abandoned altogether on 27. The Prime Minister should basically come up with a new plan. That's got 20%. And screw it, we should go for a no deal. That's 24%. So the electorate is divided three ways pretty much. And there's a sizable, a lot of people, 15%, who simply don't know what they want. How can any government hope to get a Brexit plan together that pleases everyone in the country when we are that split between what we want from Brexit at this late stage? Well,
I think we've said it before, and it might bear repeating here that the government is putting this through, and there's no way they can please everyone. I mean that's probably a more granular version of the referendum, but I mean, 52% to 48%, whatever it is, it's. The margin is so small in the vote that 50% of people would be annoyed anyway, as we know. But even then, within the vote leave side, so many people were promising so many different things that it's going to be pretty hard for them to please, I don't know, even 10% of the population. They can go ahead with that, making no concessions, no deal. And then when the actuality of no deal comes through, people will be like, oh, this is not what we were told it would be. For example,
if that deal has the support of 24% of the country, then that's not a majority. That's not a winning majority for an election.
No, it isn't.
You could go to the public, and with 40% of the vote, you might be able to win. Maybe 35% of the vote and a strong third party, you may be able to get a majority in a majority in Parliament. But 24%, that's just simply not electorally viable. So where we're at with those polls and with Brexit kind of suggests it's almost impossible for Theresa May to please the public, whatever she does, and that's where we are with Brexit at the moment. I think very unlikely that a second referendum will be held, simply because even with those numbers, you can't win a second referendum with only 27% of people thinking that Brexit should be abandoned altogether as well. No side has the power to change things, and as we suggested for many weeks now, it seems to be a sort of like this slow trudging sort of juggernaut where we're all heading towards that cliff edge and nobody can really decide what to do to pull us back.
For all of you listening to our podcast with an Android device, do us a favour and give the Podcast Republic app a try. If you've been listening on the website up until now, this app allows you to get all of your favourite podcasts directly on your Android device. You can search for the podcasts you want to listen to, select them as a favourite, and have them all just one click away. One of the best features, as far as I'm concerned, is the ability to modify podcast details locally, allowing you to customise the look and feel of your feed on your device, or rename them for better organisation. Finally, don't forget to set unparliamentary language as a favourite so you don't miss out on any new episodes from the front benches on the Podcast Republic app. And now a quick polls update. So Rob, how are the polls looking?
So the polls, if we go back to that website that we were looking at before, with those Brexit results, we can see that since the Chequers agreement, the Conservatives have fallen quite significantly and they're now below Labour. And the big winner from the Chequers agreement, it would seem, would be UKIP, who have risen quite significantly. This does seem to suggest that most people are pretty unhappy that Brexit might not happen or might not be as hard as they wanted with this Chequers agreement. So they're going back to UKIP to get that harder Brexit. And it basically means Labour didn't have to do anything. Labour's figures are pretty much around the 38% mark, but it's the Conservatives who found themselves having a significant dip. I will say, interestingly though, if you go to the Britain Elect site as well.
Yes, I've opened that up as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So Labour has had quite like a significant lead just after Chequers agreement, but the latest YouGov poll on the 23rd of July has it as a tie with the Lib Dems going up by 2, and they seem to have taken, just at first glance, they seem to have taken some votes away from Labour, perhaps, and the Lib Dems being the only sort of pro-EU party in government at the moment suggests that if no deal is going to happen, maybe more people are going to the only party that will support a no Brexit deal.
I think the thing that's interesting here, so like you said, Labour didn't have to do anything really to get that benefit. If you look at the graph on the BBC website, which is over time the voting intention, Labour is still at its lowest point on average since the 2017 election. And it's just Conservatives have just tanked in the last few weeks. And you can see that meteoric rise essentially for UKIP, where UKIP are almost up to half where they were prior to the 2017 election, before people lost confidence in them. And the Lib Dems have had a bit of a rise. It's interesting because I think we've discussed this before, how we tend to see more splits on the left than we do on the right. Normally the Conservatives have been very good at having this cohesive message. And they went into this referendum purely because they were worried about people splitting off to UKIP. And they still haven't shaken it. It's still, and until Brexit happens, I think it's still going to be a problem. And it's looking like maybe it's going to be a problem for them into the future. It would be interesting if we get to a stage where the right is splitting as much as the left have done, because that would, like the Lib Dems may gain a few people here, but the left already has this split. I mean, yes, arguably Labour has been a bit more centrist in the past, but you know what I mean? The generally left parties have this split already. So you have about 10% Lib Dems, and then you have around 40% Labour, and then you have around 40% Conservative and others. But if Conservatives split off to that level that this is suggesting, especially if, I mean, we've got 2 points here, right, with UKIP. If it keeps going on, anyone can get incomplete data, and in 10 weeks we'd have UKIP with 100% of the vote. That's obviously unlikely, but yeah, if this does actually end up causing a split, which seems more and more likely with these divisions in the Conservative Party and so on, that would be that could spell the Conservatives being out of power for a long time.
And the margins are so small for Conservatives and Labour as well. If you look back to the 2017 result, where both parties sort of massively overachieved what they thought they would get in terms of percentage of the vote, as Theresa May, despite her not being able to win a majority in Parliament, got one of the highest percentage sort of like of the vote in history. The problem was that Labour also had one of their best results ever and were just behind them. It was sort of tied at, both above 40%. That was super close. What you'd seen in the past with elections before 2017 was the Conservatives and Labour around about 35, and third parties like the Lib Dem making up a much larger chunk of the electorate, like 20%, a little bit over. The parties now find themselves in a position where either one of them loses the slightest bit of ground, the other one will be ready to pounce. So that's why it only takes a tiny bit of movement from either the Lib Dems or UKIP to have a big impact on the other two major political parties.
Okay, so we're going to start wrapping up here. We're about to have the summer recess, aren't we, Rob?
Whoop, whoop. Yes, we are. We're on holiday. Theresa May's on holiday. I don't know if you've seen the pictures of her in Italy walking with her husband. The PM, they're away, they're out to play, and whilst they're playing, we'll have some fun with some of our own little political debates at the same time. Yeah,
so this is dubbed silly season, the summer break for Parliament. So we have, is it 6 weeks?
Yes, I believe so. Like school holidays, yeah.
So essentially we can get 3 special episodes out in that time if we're sticking to our 2 weeks schedule. So yeah, we've had, we put out the call for some topic ideas for silly season. We've had some responses from YouTube comments. We've had people messaging me directly. We've had a few other comments elsewhere. We think the 3 topics we're going to try and cover, we're going to do a comparison between UK and US politics, because we've done this a little bit in the past, but talking about how, there's the US Constitution, the UK doesn't really have a constitution. What is Congress in comparison to the House of Lords, things like that. So we think that would be useful for our international listeners, and also, a bit for me. I don't know as much about US politics as I could, so I'm hoping Rob can fill me in on some of that. That will be our first kind of special episode. Then we're going to do an episode kind of post-war Britain, foreign policy, politics from the end of World War II kind of up to now, kind of giving a context to some of the discussions we've had. And we're then going to do a big topic that I know both Rob and I are really into, which is elections, voting, turnout, electoral systems, stuff like that. So talking about different types of voting, which we've touched on a bit before, and these will be like our 3 big topics. I don't know if we've set a particular time for these, so they may be a bit longer than our normal episodes. We'll see. We might release them as like a cut down actual episode, and then maybe some bonus content if we waffle on about something we're really passionate about. But yeah, going to be interesting. Hopefully maybe a bit more educational and less just discussing and reacting to the slightly mental two-week cycle of politics that we have been doing. And then in September, we will come back for season 2 when the parliamentary season starts back up. But obviously we'll mention that at the end of our silly season episodes as well, just to remind you we're coming back to politics proper come September. So as usual, you can find us on Twitter at unparlpodcast. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can search for Unparliamentary Language on Facebook and find us there. And you can find us at patreon.com/TTSS, where you can yet again give us a few more pennies in the fund towards buying Rob a better microphone. And is there anything you want to add at this point, Rob?
Just that I'm really looking forward to those summer episodes. It'll be something different, and I think I'll have a lot of fun putting them together. So I hope everybody else enjoys them. Like you said, they will be a bit more educational in that fact. But yeah, I'm looking forward to doing them and the feedback that we'll receive from them. I hope they do help people to engage with sort of different elements of politics and help people understand how things work on the other side of the pond, stuff like that.
Brilliant. So, well, without further ado, it's good night from me.
So goodbye from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Getting further away from the microphone.